in a kind of fertilizing way. And today we have a wonderful group from very different backgrounds, including two of my colleagues from the Helix Executive Committee. We are the group that brainstorm these programs and then try to organize them as best we can. The events today will be live streamed, so both in terms of knowing that sometimes a camera will be on you, and when you ask questions, just remember this will be going out on YouTube and will be there into infinity. So it's just good to remember your what you want to project into the world. And just before I mention and give the backgrounds of the participants, I want to mention the two upcoming programs, the next two at least of the many that we're organizing. One is on January 19th on mathematical models and the mind. And then on February 9th, we will be having a roundtable on status and what that means in society and in human relationships and animal and tribal systems. So two very interesting other events coming. Today we have an author, a filmmaker, we have a scientist and a professor of ethics, human and animal ethics, and we have two of the members, as I mentioned, of the executive committee, William Grassi, who is a historian of religion and a scholar and author, and Gerald Hurwitz, who is a psychiatrist and a professor of psychiatry at Columbia. And they're more familiar. I'm not going to read a great deal about their backgrounds. They're all online. And then Josh Aronson, as I said, is a filmmaker, and he's currently, after a very distinguished career of many different subjects and topics, today in his current time, he is making a film about the use of animals, specifically dogs, in the treatment of veterans with PTSD. Does it have a title yet?
To be of service.
To be of service.
As in service dogs.
About service
and
dogs.
Vets, right?
Wonderful.
Right.
And as I say, he's done films in the past, some of which have been Oscar nominated, such as The Sound and the Fury, about children who were capable of getting implants that would allow them to hear when their parents were deaf. He's done one called Orchestra of Exiles, which was about the formation of the Palestine Symphony, and which then became the Israeli Philharmonic, from musicians that were taken from the orchestras during the Holocaust in Europe, and a whole variety of different topics, which I won't go into now, but you can raise what you would like to include. And Elizabeth Hess is an author, and she writes about animals. She's the author of two books on animals. The first, Lost and Found, Dog, Cats, and Everyday Heroes, is a Harcourt Brace book. And the second, Nim Chimpsky, The Chimp Who Would Be Human, was published by Bantam in 2008. And that book was the basis for Project Nim, a documentary film by James Mash. And right now she's working on two book projects, one on the American Pit Bull Terrier, the rise of blood sports in the USA, and the racial construction of bias against the dogs. And the second is a book about the first primate research laboratory in New York, LEMSIP, the Laboratory for Experimental Medicine and Surgery in Primates, associated with NYU. And she will tell you more of what she does. She's also the vice chair of the Animal Legal Defense Fund and a member of the advisory board of Out of the Pits, the first pit bull rescue in the country. She lives with two pit bulls saved from a dog fighting ring in Alabama. And James Serpell is the Marie Moore Endowed Chair of Animal Ethics and Welfare at the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a bachelor's degree in zoology from University College London and a PhD in animal behavior from the University of Liverpool. He focuses on the behavior and welfare of dogs and cats, the development of human attitudes to animals, and the history and impact of human-animal relationships. He's published more than 180 articles and books, is the author, editor, co-editor of several, including Animals and Human Society, Changing Perspectives in the Company of Animals, Companion Animals, and Us. And he's the creator of a widely used canine behavioral assessment and research questionnaire. So you can hear all of the depth and expertise and the humanity of the group that is now going to begin their informal discussion.
Well, I thought downstairs that it would be fun to start off by introducing a childhood pet. I got a puppy from my bus driver in 4th grade and called it Fuzzball. Fuzzball was a border collie, and this is in suburban Wilmington, Delaware. And in the 70s, the dogs were never on leashes. They just sort of wandered around the neighborhood. And Fuzzball was never lived inside. She was mostly covered with ticks. But she would chase cars, and we would clock her at like 40 miles an hour, biting at the heels of cars up and down the neighborhood. But she was a remarkable dog, and she was very, very loyal to me, and she followed me everywhere on my walks and waited for me when I visited with friends. And, there was that line from, it was the Garrison Killer or whatever, hoping to live up to my dog's expectations of me. But I've had many intimate animal relationships since then, including working with slaughter. So we can talk more about that. But I have a lot of philosophical indigestion when it comes to talking about the animal-human continuum. A real tough thing. Anyway, that's me. I'm William Grassi.
I'm Josh Aronson, and I love the theme of childhood pets. I have a different relationship, though, and it's interesting because the arc from my childhood relationship with animals and the relationship I have today, having spent the last 18 months with veterans who have service dogs, it's quite an arc, because I had traumatic experiences with pets because of my mother, who was not an animal person at all, but somehow we could have pets. I had pets. The first one was a Springer Spaniel, the first one I remember that was powerful for me. It was very much my dog. His name was Julius, and we had a lot of Springers, and all of them named Caesars, different Caesars. He was the first of them, Julius Caesar. And when I went off to college, came to New York to go to college, and I said goodbye to my dog, thinking I'd come back. And I came home from the first semester, and he wasn't there. My mother had him put to sleep because he had some illness and didn't want to spend the money to send him to the vet or operate on him or whatever was necessary.
Same thing happened to Fuzzball.
Same thing.
Yeah, college.
Well, I was stunned that I wasn't even notified. That my mother it never occurred to me that there was a connection that might have been deeper than just some casual connection. But in fact, it was a very deep connection. Because like Fuzzball, I used to just go around with that dog on my bicycle and just knew he was my pal. Mm-hmm. And he was exterminated without my even knowledge of it. And she continued that kind of relationship with my pets very traumatically, and I really just blocked it out. I did. And now I've been with many, many veterans who say that their dog has saved their life. The fact of having a dog in their life, who's a highly trained service dog, the bond has saved their life. And so it sort of brought me back to its deep connection to these animals. And talk more about that as we get on with our conversation.
Yes. I find it very difficult, actually, to pin down one childhood pet, because I always feel my childhood was something like the sort of Gerald Darrell, My Family and Other Animals kind of situation, where there was a sort of endless stream of animals went through my household, and I was usually the instigator. And my parents were remarkably tolerant of, the snakes, the lizards, the rats, the mice, you name it, I had them. And I was profoundly attached to them, so much so that I think when I got to about the age of 12, my parents decided there must be something wrong with me and took me to actually a psychiatrist on Harley Street in London. And he sat me down and he did, if forget what the test is called, where you draw a squiggle on a piece of paper and you're asked to turn it into something more kind of comprehensive. And I saw this squiggle and instantly saw a gorilla in the shape. So I completed the design of the gorilla. And he said, perhaps that's how you see me. And I looked at him, and he was a very fragile-looking man. And I thought, I don't think so. But I was very polite. I didn't say anything. So, yes, I just constantly been surrounded by animals, and I'm still surrounded by animals. And I can't imagine life somehow without them. It'd be very difficult.
Yes, my first pets were 2 turtles. Got them at the circus, and my mother promptly named them Gin and Tonic. And they lived for a month, and they were flushed down the toilet at the end of their lives, something that was common.
You threw a lime in?
we threw the lime in.
Sorry.
And after that, I had the same experience. Our first dog that the family had was a little schnauzer named Churchill, and my mother bought it at Gimbel's department store, and I adored the dog. It was my dog. I walked the dog, and I went away to camp one summer, and I came back, and the dog was gone. And I said, where's Churchill? And they said, gone. We got rid of him. You went away. And that was it.
Wow.
So I think this was a fairly common experience. Yeah.
Wow,
Very
what a
interesting.
wound. Jerry?
Oh, so I had one wonderful relationship with my dog growing up, Dusty Dog, who lived to the ripe age, I think, of 17 or 18, so it was my entire childhood. And he was a mutt. It looked like a Wheaton Terrier, but was very lively and extremely quick-witted. And I have to say that I really did experience him as being a person, because of his intelligence and his engagement with everyone, not just with me. He was very lively. But one of the funny little stories about how clever he was that we lived in this row home neighborhood in Philadelphia, and there was a dog in heat, a female dog in heat across the street, and I think there were because as Bill said earlier, a lot of dogs were off leash in those days. There were a collection of about 7 or 8 dogs outside the house, like with his vigil. And Dusty went out to join him, but I think at some point realized that if he went around the block and came around the back, he didn't have any competition. So now whether or not that's what his thinking was, I don't know, or he just happened to come down that block. But we were wondering, where is he? Because all the other male dogs are out in front. And so we said, wait a minute, maybe he's elsewhere. And so he had camped out behind, so he had less competition there. Really incredible how much I think many of us, when we engage with animals, can see them as persons. There's a quality of personhood that some of them have. I'm not sure they all do, but I know that Dusty Dog did.
If we pay attention. My dog, first year, came in heat, was had by every dog in the neighborhood, and had a litter of 12 puppies. And my mother, who's a farm girl from Manitoba, in the Depression, we sorted the 12 puppies, took 7 of them, and put them right in a bucket of water and drowned them. and that was a lesson. I said, Mom, I'm sure glad you didn't drown me, but that's that's the kind of attitude, a farm attitude, and I admire that. We have 900 million dogs in the world, almost 1 billion cattle. We haven't even started talking about food animals. I read a statistic recently that 95% of the biomass, of mammalian biomass, is humans and our domesticated animals at this point. So 10 to 5% of the remaining biomass of mammals are wild animals. They must have missed the rats in New York City, I think, in that count. But anyway, we have grown so much. It's a big business. What did you say? It's
85 million.
85 in the United States.
Billion, I'm sorry.
Billion in the United States right now.
Yeah.
And so these relationships with our animals, the ones we love and the ones we eat, are hugely complicated on so many different levels. But you're involved in training. You're part of the business.
To some extent, yes. In the sense, I'm trying to train veterinarians, to be ethical. Which, it sounds as though you wouldn't need to, but actually I think a lot of veterinarians have a lot of difficulty with this, because on the one side they're required to represent their clients, who are people who have interests in animals, which may or may not be beneficial relationships they have with their animals, and on the other side they're supposed to be representing the welfare and the health of the animal, and frequently those come in conflict, and it's a big problem for a lot of these young people. They're very conflicted. They don't know.
Well, they have their own love affairs with animals.
They have their own love affairs with animals, and they are faced with a client who walks into their practice and says, "I want you to put my dog down," and the vet says, "Why?" "Well, I don't want it anymore."
And curiously, my daughter, who's a vet, says that the holiday season is a particularly big time for euthanizing animals.
Yeah, it's true, because people are given...
It's also a great time to go to a shelter to adopt an animal, because within a month after Christmas, the shelters are full of extraordinary purebred, mixed breed, every kind of dog and cat that you can imagine, from all that impulse purchasing.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually, these are often animals that have been around for a long time for some reason. It's not just impulse purchasing.
It's both.
Yeah.
They give away the old
right.
one to get the new one, or they buy the new puppy at the pet store and take it home, and it proceeds to, eat through their apartment, and they don't want it anymore.
Yeah.
Well, it's amazing to me, just hearing our stories about pets, how dramatic some of these stories are. I mean, like intensely dramatic. There aren't too many other things that many of us experience, I guess, in our sort of everyday lives that are like, these are really dramatic and intense stories about loss and killing, right?
Yeah.
Intentional killing, and treating these beings as commodities, I guess,
Right.
of some sort. Yeah.
Well, let's get it on the table. I eat meat. Anybody else here eat meat around the table? So right here, I mean, I've had the opportunity to see what slaughterhouses look like from start to finish as a young man. That's pretty scary. The smell and the noise, and it stays with you for a long time.
What kind of slaughterhouse were you in?
It was beef in Belgrade. That's a long story.
That's pre-Temple Grandin.
Yes.
So it was really scary.
Yeah, it was a small-scale slaughterhouse,
Yeah.
but
It's not that much better with Temple Grandin either,
Really?
really.
and it's more
The
about
film makes it look like it's a big improvement.
It's more about I think her
fiction
stuff is
film
more
or
about
the-
The Errol Morris documentary.
how to handle the cattle. The vets and the caretakers need to handle the cattle, and
Yeah.
but done that too. So and then hand milk cows at a summer camp in Vermont, for instance, stuff like that. And so I always approach things from an evolutionary point of view, and so in the evolution of humans, meat eating is incredibly important in the growth of our brain and in the way that we live. And apparently our ancestors, whenever they arrived, they hunted all the large mammals to extinction in North America, South America, Australia. So it's a really interesting question, and how do we deal with that ethically? You're the ethicist. You eat meat. How do you deal with your indigestion?
Well, exactly. I mean, you talk about philosophical indigestion. It's an indigestible topic. This whole issue of how you deal with these moral conflicts in relation to animals. And it's becoming more intense now, especially with the environmental concerns over CO2 and beef production.
Well, that's
specifically. So
that's a no-brainer at this point.
This is becoming a huge issue, and will continue to become a huge issue going forwards. And people are now saying, if you eat beef, you're essentially destroying the planet. You shouldn't be doing it. And I think that's adding an additional layer on the ethical concerns about the welfare of the animal. It's it's adding this whole component of what are we doing to the planet. Yeah, it's very, very intense situation, and we're in a state of flux. That's the other interesting thing, is that we're coming from a time when people really didn't think about these issues very much, and in a very short space of time, in a few decades, really, it's become a central topic of conversation. Everybody is thinking about it and agonizing about it at some level, and it's these are interesting times we live in. It's interesting to see how it all pans out.
Betsy, if the scientists figure out how to culture flesh, animal flesh, without the feathers and the squawking and the legs, would that be something that you would eat?
Oh, sure. I mean,
You welcome the idea.
I eat all kinds of things, but I don't eat things where I know the animal has suffered to get on my plate. So I happen to live in the Hudson Valley, so I eat fresh eggs from my friend's farm, and I do eat meat, on that level. But there's no question that vegan food is coming, and it's going to taste good, and it's going to taste just like meat, because that's what vegans want. Meat eaters think that's a contradiction.
Right.
But already one of the biggest vegan burger meat producers has joined forces with Tyson Foods, which is pretty interesting because Tyson is one of the biggest exploiters of chickens. As I don't know if you've been in a chicken slaughterhouse.
I've done that too.
But they say if you go visit all those slaughterhouses, you can't still eat meat, but you are. But it's certain kinds, I bet. I bet you want to know where the piece of meat on your plate came from.
Well, I never made a living in slaughterhouses. So I've visited them, and at camp I was in charge of the.
Why did you visit?
It's a long story.
Probably a good one.
And I lived on a horse and cattle farm, so I know and I've worked on dairy farms for short periods, so I know what's involved. I know what it means, and for me, it turns out that I also spent 2 weeks at Auschwitz in 1983 teaching young Germans about the Holocaust, and the images of the slaughterhouse and the Holocaust are, it's the same motif, and so. At some level, if we can do this if we can treat other humans like animals, is it moral to treat animals like animals?
Yeah.
So that's one level in which I get moral indigestion, philosophical indigestion.
Well, I mean...
On the other hand, I don't think utilitarian ethics works.
No.
So, the greatest good for the greatest,
Right, the Peter Singer.
Number, and I don't think the hierarchy of consciousness works. I think pigs that I've known, we had a pig pet back at the farm in Pennsylvania where the kids grew up, and certainly a lot smarter than the dogs, if we want to talk about animal consciousness. Pigs are very smart animals, and
They're just messy pets.
they're just messy pets. I don't recommend it for, although I did see a woman with a small potbelly pig once in New York City.
There's a bunch of pigs that are therapy animals, actually, in New York City, working. And I went to visit AIDS hospice facility in New Jersey with a therapy potbelly pig. And it was one of the great experiences of my life, because when you're lying there feeling horrible and a pig walks into your room, I mean, what can you do but laugh and get up and say hello to the pig? And this pig brought so much laughter and joy and hilarity to this incredibly depressing place that the pig was, a celebrity and welcome guest as often as this pig's handler could get there. And the pig was a registered, Delta Society, I guess it's called Pet Partners now, therapy animal.
Well, what is a therapy pig? How are they trained, or what is it that they do differently from a normal pig?
Well, first of all, they're potbellies, so they're small. They're not hogs. You're not getting a 400-pound
Right, yeah.
pig out of your truck. But they're, as he just said, pigs are smarter than dogs.
Right.
So they need to be housebroken. They need to be socialized
Get to
around
talk to them.
humans,
Get to talk
which
to
is,
them.
they understand a lot of language, the same way I'm sure all of us talk to our dogs, and they they don't speak English, but they understand what we're talking about.
My question was, is there anything different between just a regular garden variety pot-bellied pig with all these qualities and a therapy pig?
Yeah, not all animals are suitable to therapy work. And everybody gets a dog and wants their dog to be a therapy dog now.
Right.
And not all to have a therapy dog or a therapy pig, the handler is doing the therapy essentially, not just the pig. And it's a team. And you're trained
You have to be trained.
in the Pet Partners program to be that team in how to relate to people. But the key to it is having an extremely well-socialized animal. And you can really socialize pigs. I mean, I also went to a nursing home with a donkey. And it was also a great experience. The donkey wasn't so well housebroken. But the donkey walked into this nursing home like he had been visiting his relatives there for years. And he walked down the hall, and he walked into each room, said hello, stood there for a few minutes, walked out, walked into the next room. And, there was one, this was an amazing experience. We walked into this room, and this woman was lying asleep in bed, and the donkey walked over to her bed and stuck his head over the rail and snorted loudly. And I thought, oh my God, this woman's going to have a heart attack. And instead, she sat up in bed, threw her arms around the donkey, and gave him the biggest kiss I've ever seen. And I said, you seem to know donkeys. And she said, yes, my husband was a veterinarian. I was around many farm animals, and this has been my best day here by meeting this donkey. I mean, there are all kinds of animals being used in interesting situations now, and I think the dogs are, obviously they're the most common therapy animals, and dogs are so trainable and so willing to be our slaves in a sense, and
Affection slaves.
our affection slaves, and we ask them to be that often, but I think
And they enjoy it.
some of them do.
For the most part, they enjoy it.
I think they do. I think, I think dogs can be overwhelmed by people, too. But, there are more challenging kinds of animals that are used in different kinds of therapy sessions, which are interesting. I mean, there's...
Horses are often
used.
Yes,
Chickens.
yeah.
Parrots are used.
Birds.
Parrots.
Parrots, yeah.
I mean, chickens, somebody who has a flock of chickens who has them in a school situation said that the chickens were really good because it's very hard to get to know a chicken. So therefore, if you're an adolescent that has, for instance, a lot of trouble getting to know people, having to work out a relationship with a chicken is quite demanding. And she insists that everyone get to the point where that chicken will get on their lap comfortably and relax with them. And it takes some time. And the kids, of course, love the chickens.
I never gave the chickens a chance. It was the only animal.
You still can.
The only animal I didn't feel bad about killing.
So, Josh, in terms of the dogs that are used with the veterans, what are their specific qualities? I know some of them make the grade and some of them don't.
Well, the qualities of the dogs that are selected to be finally allowed to be service dogs and are trained through completion have specific qualities. They're very good with children. If some dogs, no matter how much you train them, are not responsive to children or even are frightened of children, those are immediately disqualified. If a dog has problems in busy areas or noisy areas, they're immediately disqualified. If a dog won't get into a confined space under a table and stay there comfortably for a length of time, like a dinner, they're disqualified because they can't train that out of them. So about 10% of the dogs they start with in service training are rejected, and those are great pets to adopt because they've been trained so much more than comfort animals that they're quite phenomenal. Now, you might even object to it because they're so responsive that they lose their dogness, because they're so connected. But I was interested to hear you describe what comfort animals are, because it's a big controversy in the service dog world for two reasons. One, because people are getting fake service dog certification, and the reason they do that is they want to be able to travel with their dogs on airplanes. And of course, if you have a dog that shouldn't be on an airplane, and there have been accidents where
Which
dogs...
is most dogs.
Which is most dogs, right? But well-trained service dogs,
Yeah, they're
you
fine.
you can take them on an airplane, and they'll be under a seat. Even a Labrador Retriever will squeeze under the chair in front of you for 2 hours and won't budge. It's remarkable to see.
Yeah.
And they come right out. So comfort dogs won't do that, and they get dogs and they try and do this with them. But what's important about the distinction between the comfort dog and the service dog, is all the things you said that a comfort dog has, service dogs have, but they have something else that's profound, which is the ability to bond so completely one-on-one with their companion. So it's that bond that works in a very deep way to help them unwind the symptoms of PTSD. It's just the absolute unconditional love that those dogs feel one-on-one. Now, any dog can feel that, but in a service dog, when you combine it with so many other things, it's a profound therapeutic tool.
Yeah.
It's very powerful.
Also used in prisons very effectively. So I'm interested in we're so inhumane to the animals, but our pets humanize us. So what do you think's going on? Why is this relationship with a dog or a cat or a pig or whatever? Why does that? What is it that we get from them that we don't get from other humans?
Well, I think in terms of service dogs with people, whoever, it might not just be veterans. It can be, service dogs can be, blind people, obviously. It can be autistic children, often get them. It's just complete, absolute devotion, and what they call, over and over again, you hear of unconditional love. And how powerful the unconditional love is in the veteran community is because a lot of veterans have moral injury, as they call it today, and they have a lot of guilt and shame, which are two powerful things, because they've been commanded to, as 19-year-olds, to do things that are morally reprehensible, or they've seen things that are so awful that they're embarrassed and they're shamed and they're guilty, or because their mates have died. And what runs through their mind is what they could have done to save them for the next 30 years.
Right.
So they are so filled with shame that they can't release it, and they end up often as shut-ins. And all over the country, there's hundreds of thousands of veterans who are shut-ins. And they get a dog, a service dog, and the dog has to go out. So the first step is he has to take responsibility for the dog and take the dog out. And he learns very quickly that no matter what he does, even if he's weeping, even if he's crying, even if he's having a nightmare, if he's just sullen, the dog will love him, and the dog will lick him and wake him up from nightmares and be his companion. And so gradually he lets go and starts to love the dog. It seems to be pretty consistent, and it's the first time he's felt anything in a long time, he or she, because a lot of women vets have PTSD as well. And that's a powerful mechanism. And I once asked someone I was interviewing in the film, who was a writer who knew a lot about dogs, I said, well, why isn't the unconditional love of a spouse equally good for that? And he said, oh, the old joke, you put your wife and your dog in a trunk of a car and close the trunk, open it an hour later, who loves you at the end of an hour? Right? Well,
they're excited.
Like, they're excited. Dad.
It's you again.
Your wife won't speak to you for 2 weeks, right? So
2 weeks.
Well, maybe more than an hour, right? 1 hour. But it's a very good story because this defines what unconditional love is.
Well, one of the things I think that happens in a lot of psychiatric illnesses, and certainly PTSD, is among them, and I'm not sure people generally appreciate this very much, but it's that caregivers get rebuffed often. I mean, there are efforts to sort of cheer you up or encourage you or to get you to do something like get outside or get out of bed. You're met with a lot of pushback. It could be in various forms. And we might imagine someone with PTSD could be irritable, but there's all sorts of ways people can push back. And their psychiatric illness keeps them from responding to the normal social cues. And the failure of those social cues often demoralizes the caregivers. So the caregivers give up to some degree and withdraw, and they start to dismiss the sufferer. So a dog or another animal who's trained in this way just keeps it up. It does not. They're not as readily discouraged. They take it many more iterations, and that's what you're calling unconditional love. Is that you could mistreat me, I still think you're great, right?
Yeah.
And also they can't talk, which I think is very critical. They can't,
Talk back.
ask you how you're feeling. They can't criticize the fact that you're not getting out of
You're
bed.
still in bed, dog,
and that kind of thing. The animal is it's empathic, but it's not verbal, and I think it's very critical.
Yeah.
But it's very clear, though, that the dogs can take on and understand your
Yeah.
feelings,
Yeah.
and they are very empathic. So if you're sad or you're sick or you're in bed or you're not getting out of bed, the dog will come to you and will curl up with you, will lick you, will encourage you to, and make you feel better.
Right.
Because, of course, when you pet a dog or look into the eyes of a dog, there's an oxytocin release, and it feels good. So it's a very, very powerful connection that happens with a bonded animal and a human.
My dogs love it when I'm sick in bed all day.
Yeah, they get to be with you all
They just
day.
love it. They just curl up
Hang
and they're
with
so
you all
happy.
day.
But not to take it away from the psychological realm here, I think the other big attraction to dogs, I mean, there's so many dogs in New York City now, it's just mind-boggling. And I think we live in a world where nature is receding. Certainly the wilderness is receding, the waters are rising, and I think having this dog in our homes with us is a bit of the wild, literally. And, what I like about my dog is dogs are, they're unpredictable. I can't really always predict what they're going to do or what's going to happen when a stranger walks into the house or, they take you out of the human realm and back to, a wilder moment and bring that into your life. And I think that's a lot of why city people love dogs.
It's the connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And what do you ask on the test that you've developed?
Oh,
The canine behavioral assessment and research questionnaire.
Yeah, that's actually it came about because I wanted to collect behavioral information about dogs, and they're very difficult to study because they live in people's houses, and you can't go in there and say, "Do you mind if I sit in your house and observe your dog?" So I was looking at the sort of psychological literature, and I found, of course, that with child psychologists, they have the same issue. And very often they resort to questionnaires, so surveys which they give to parents and give to teachers and so on to ask them about the child's behavior. So I thought, well, let's develop something like that for dogs. So I did that. And
What do you ask?
well, it's all sorts of questions about how the dog responds to different things in its environment. And it tries to persuade the owner to be as unbiased as possible in their evaluation. So you don't say, is your dog friendly? You'd say, how does your dog respond specifically when this happens, like a stranger comes to the door or whatever? And try and pin them down to very specific things. It's a 100-item questionnaire. You can go online and complete it for your
I
dog.
took it.
And it'll churn out a little chart that will tell you where your dog lies in relation to other dogs in our database. We have about 50,000 dogs in the database now, so it's a good sample.
So along what dimensions, like how are they evaluated?
Aggression, fearfulness, anxiety, excitability, attachment and attention-seeking, separation-related behavior, all the, pretty much the gamut.
Are you collecting the eugenics information too about the breeds and?
Well, I am collecting breed information. We're doing some very interesting research on breed differences in behavior.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Of course, there are differences, but I think dog breeds are a terrible thing.
What do you mean?
I just think they're really terrible.
You mean
Why?
the creative ones? You mean?
That just, there's, I think it's eugenics. It's bad for humans, it's bad for dogs. And the more you mix things up, the better.
Dogs are not humans.
No,
I mean,
I'm talking about genetics. It's just-
I know,
It's just,
but, I think it's not a bad thing to think of your dog as a person, to treat your dog as a family member, but they are animals. And one of the things about I think it's great that the dogs are being used so heavily with vets right now and for the PTS programs. And I can't believe that at the end of the year, I must have gotten 20 direct mail pieces asking me to give money to programs for PTS dogs for vets. They're springing up like, mushrooms after the rain everywhere in every community. And there's a good reason for it. I think the reason is it's working and it's expensive. But I would still ask the question, why aren't we giving our vets decent health care? And now what we're doing is we have these private organizations throwing dogs at them when the hospitals are overcrowded, vets can't see doctors, and essentially we treat them not well. So I think we tend to use dogs as a kind of Band-Aid for certain problems, and we're using them for everything now. Cadaver dogs, bomb dogs, drug dogs, PTSD dogs. I mean, we want dogs to do an incredible amount of work for us that we don't want to do.
But dogs.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
I don't think.
Okay, good.
I don't think I agree at all. Actually, the truth is also dogs like doing those things. They
Exactly.
love having
How do you
jobs.
know that?
Well, you can see in their behavior and the way they respond.
Maybe dogs like sleeping all day in front of the fireplace, too.
Well,
Some do.
No, there have been. I mean, we have done studies of, for example, therapy dogs and whether or not, that there's a welfare problem in using dogs for this purpose. And actually, every single one of the studies that's been done to date suggests that the dogs are enjoying it.
Like work.
For them, it's a much worse experience going to a veterinary hospital than going to visit people in a human hospital.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes sense
That
when
makes
you
sense.
understand the dog's perspective, because
No, I think
And
veterinary
from the
hospital is a
human
bad
perspective,
thing.
from the human perspective, not the VA perspective, but the human perspective, the idea of therapy, you're absolutely right. The VA is letting us down. The government is letting soldiers down in every possible way. Not universally. I mean, the VA here in New York City is quite good. There's very good therapists. In Los Angeles, it's quite good. But those are 2 out of thousands. And many, many soldiers that I interviewed just report horrible stories about the VA. But most of the therapists that I interviewed and most of the soldiers I interviewed found that the service dogs, in conjunction with good therapy and the appropriate meds, as a trio of approaches, is a very good approach. And of course, there's something now called the MAPS program. There's programs using MDMA, working with vets, that's been very, very powerful. And some of them also have dogs. So I think there's a lot of modalities of treatment for PTSD that are being utilized, and the dogs are simply part of it. One of the vets said, some people have crutches, some people have, walkers, some people use drugs. I have a dog. It's a medical modality that's organic, that works very well for me and has brought me back to life. And a lot of people report the same language.
Yeah, I think
Now,
it
that's the
works.
human perspective.
It's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad
And you're
thing.
arguing maybe it's not good for the dogs. From my observation...
No, for some of the dogs,
Yeah.
I don't think it is good. And there are instances when dogs have been pulled away from vets. I don't know if you've come across any of them
No,
for your
I have
film,
not.
because the dogs are considered in danger for
So
their lives.
I just want to point out that there are, 900 million dogs in the world right now, and half of them are feral, living on our trash in an urban environment or around humans.
And we're
living-
breeding dogs for
and-
these programs.
And that, so, our dogs in New York City are treated pretty well. The one thing that I tell anybody who wants a dog is 2 are better than 1. Because they're very social, and to leave a dog alone in an apartment is torture for that dog. And we have a neighbor, I keep telling her, and the dog's always barking, and I say, 2 dogs are better than 1. And, they don't get it. So that, just a bit of practical advice. Dogs hate being left alone.
In fact, all species pretty much do.
Well, they're especially. I mean, cat doesn't mind as much being left alone, but it's better to have 2 cats, right?
Yeah.
Or a cat and a dog or whatever. So just for the humanity of our pets, just understand a little bit about their psychology. The truth of the matter is, humans are mammals too. We have feelings. We're very social, and humans don't like being left alone. And that's why, one of the reasons why a dog and a person who's otherwise isolated is so healthy, not just mentally healthy, physiologically healthy in every way. So, but yeah, don't leave your poor dog locked up alone in an apartment. Not a nice thing to do.
I wanted to go back to a comment you made earlier, Bill, which was this, I think, rather bold claim that pigs are much smarter than dogs. So I wanted to flesh that out. No pun intended. I wanted to know, well, on what basis. I'm not challenging you. I think it's
No, I
a
think-
generally
I
interesting conversation,
think-
which is
Sort of
how do we
common
know
knowledge.
what it means? Is
I
it
think
smartness
people who know
in one dimension?
People who know the barnyard would know that.
But what do they know about that?
What do they see?
And also, understand, I don't
Okay.
think smartness is on one,
No,
is a one-dimensional sort
exactly
of,
right.
right?
There's no IQ test for pigs or dogs.
Right.
Maybe not for humans. So anyway, you can take what you want, but
Just
they are-
rats.
they're just rats. They are very smart animals.
Right.
And, again, if we took the Peter Singer hierarchy of consciousness model of the ethics of animal eating, then squid and octopus and cuttlefish would go right out the door, because they are extraterrestrial intelligence, interterrestrial intelligence that we barely understand, but they're clearly very smart and sensate. But again, I don't think the Peter Singer version works. I don't think utilitarian ethics works. I think the only thing that can work in our relationship with animals is a sacramental attitude. And I say that as somebody who's not really speaking as religiously. I just think that we eat animals, we sacrifice their lives. It's called the great Eucharistic law, eat and be eaten. All of us will die, and the atoms will be recycled, and the greatest honor we do to the animals that we kill is to pay attention, and be grateful, and a little bit have some indigestion, and about it. So that's how I frame it.
Not to mention kill them humanely.
Well, so this is where.
And thank them when you kill them.
And thank you. So this is, again, I think we're not the first humans to fall in love with our animals. I think that's been going on throughout human history, and is reflected in mythology and a whole bunch of other things. So, and we're not the first generation to treat animals poorly either. So.
No, ever since the domestication of animals, they've been treated poorly, essentially. I mean, they've been, rounded up and used for work, and excess ones have been killed. And
along the way, farmers and herders have fallen in love with those animals.
Yes.
And one of the things that they have to teach veterinarians is how to recognize bestiality, right, as a problem. We don't like to talk about it, but it's there in our culture.
Well, I think vets need to be allowed to love animals and save them. And one of the things about vet school is, you take these live animals and you cut them up and you throw them in the bin, or not. I mean, are you at Johns Hopkins? Is that?
No.
Oh, okay.
University
There
of
was someone
They
here.
don't do that so much at vet schools.
Oh, okay.
They don't do vivisection as part
No,
of
but they have a huge school of researching alternatives to using animals in all research, including vet schools.
At Johns Hopkins, they do. I mean, the vet schools are increasingly trying to avoid doing practice surgeries on live animals. So that's going out the window. It may be still present at some vet schools, but it's no longer present at mine.
That's good.
But when I first got there, they were doing that, and in fact, it was the students who eventually put a stop to it. In other words, the students said, "Enough, we don't need this," and eventually the faculty were forced to agree. But there was a tradition within the faculty that, we couldn't send these students out to practice veterinary medicine unless they'd cut up a live animal. So that was where it came from. But now it's recognized that they can learn that stuff on the job under the supervision of a trained veterinarian. They don't have to do it in vet school.
And we don't use chimpanzees for car crash studies anymore either, for instance, or, certain kinds of toxicology studies, because we recognize now, because there's a law that says we can't.
And we can give them surgery practice by taking them out to animal shelters where they help spay and neuter unwanted animals prior to being adopted. So
Tufts does that.
They're learning the job skills in a humane and respectful way, I guess you would say.
Elizabeth, I was struck by your new book, which is on the cultural bias of having pets or animals.
No. This is a book on the pit bull.
On the pit bull.
Which is inherently a mixed breed and a mutt. So it's not a purebred dog, unless you talk to the Brits and they think it's a Staffordshire Terrier and it's a purebred dog.
But I thought I heard that there was a cultural bias.
Yes, I think there is.
To pit bulls specifically, you mean?
Absolutely.
I see, okay.
I mean, one of the problems with pit bulls, there are more ordinances across the country saying pit bulls can't live in this neighborhood than there are about golden retrievers.
Dogs.
What?
They're not inherently violent dogs.
They're not inherently violent dogs. There's just more of them because they're bred on every corner by drug dealers and whatever. but all these pit bulls that are flooding every shelter across the country, people don't understand, these are the losers. These are the dogs that the drug dealers and the dog fighters don't want. Because to get one dog worth training to go into the pit for a fight, you have to breed hundreds. Because most of them don't want to fight. And you have to get a really gamey, the kind of dog that's going to end up working for the police as a cadaver dog or a bomb dog because they're just so the police are using a lot of pit bulls now. Because if you get a really, hyper gamey dog and you put them to work, the dog excels. It's got a lot of energy. Training them to fight each other is an ordeal. Cost a lot of time and money. And most of them won't do it. So it's just, they're a huge problem in this country. And when most people and most buildings, for instance, say no pit bulls here, what they often mean is no poor people, no people who might be associated with drugs or crime, often people of color. I mean, the word pit bull kicks off all kinds of racial and economic biases.
The same way that German Shepherd.
German Shepherd used to, that's for sure.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Because for me, I have a bias, but only because of what I've read in the papers. There are enough pit bull incidents of pit bulls going after someone or tearing someone's face apart. And you've read it enough, so you think, well, it must be in their DNA that they're just aggressive animals.
No, there's no aggression gene. And there's a very well-known dog trainer named Ian Dunbar who sort of was the first trainer to deal with, quote, dangerous dogs. And when asked, as he always is, what is the most dangerous dog you ever met, he tells a story about an older woman who had a Shih Tzu who she was extremely close to, and the dog slept here every night. And the dog was older, around 7 or 8 years old. And one morning she woke up, and she startled the dog, and the dog woke up and bit the nose off her face. And, that was the most difficult dog that Ian Dunbar ever worked with, and that was a 15-pound Shih Tzu. And if you look at dog statistic bites, at real dog statistic bites, you will see that the pit bull's not the number one biter. It's little dogs.
Terriers.
It's the little guys. The thing is, their mouths are so small,
I still got a
they
scar.
don't do so much damage, but it's the little dogs that bite.
Why is that, do you think?
Probably frightened.
What is that?
Probably frightened.
Easily frightened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's defense.
It's self-defense, yeah.
Interesting. I thought, when I heard the description of Rook, I thought it was about how, because I came across this, that culturally, in the African-American community, you find less dogs in their homes. And I asked, and in my research and the work I've done in my film across the country, there are very few African-Americans that have service dogs. Several, but amongst, 95% were white or Hispanic. And I asked around, and I finally, these African-Americans that had dogs, I sort of worked through them. And I heard two different things. One was African Americans in America don't have dogs because police use dogs, and the dogs in the inner cities are frightening to them because they're trained and aggressive, so they're afraid of dogs. And the African Americans said, no, that's not true anymore. It was in the last generation. And so I thought your book was sort of on that topic because of the description of it somehow. I didn't get what it was, but I found it a very interesting subject. Because we were, of course, looking for African Americans and Hispanics to have in our film, and it was hard to find them with service dogs.
Have you found women?
Yes, we have a lot
Lots
of women. Yeah, a lot of women, yeah. But, of course, the cause of PTSD in most of the women is rape, not combat. The statistic is horrific. 90% of women in the military have been sexually harassed, if not raped. Not raped, but 90% have been harassed. So.
Well, I'd want a pit bull or a German Shepherd by my side in that case.
Yeah.
With that Shih Tzu.
Well, that Shih Tzu, right? Of course, I don't know how the Shih Tzu would do against a lead sergeant at 230
Probably
pounds.
well.
Okay, there's a nose.
Yeah, but it's pretty high up, though.
Are there a different group coming into training to be veterinarians?
Say that
Is
again.
there
Jen.
anything changing in the applicants to train as veterinarians?
Well, there's been a huge change change over the last 30 or 40 years from men to women. So now we have the incoming classes of veterinary students at vet schools are about 80% female, and they used to be 80% male. So that's been a massive change, and that's brought with it, I think, many of these changes in attitudes to animals and a resistance to buying into the old sort of exploitation position, and being much more compassionate and concerned about these types of issues. I mean, actually, you often hear a lot of the older male vets bemoaning this, saying, oh, God, they're feminizing the profession. You'll hear them muttering darkly. But I think it's all for the good, actually, in general.
Well, my oldest daughter is a vet, and so I followed her career at Penn, and I think they have I understand that they have a harder time getting vets who want to do agricultural animals.
That's true.
It's all either equine or small animal, and so if it's more competitive than medical school in terms of getting accepted. It's a growing industry, and if you do want to get into vet school, say you want to do agricultural animals, because it's a leg up. There's just all the extension services around are lacking veterinarians.
It's a hard life, though. Being a large animal veterinarian is a very hard life.
It's actually very dangerous, too.
Dangerous and very hard work.
Yeah.
Very hard work.
And you get no sleep.
But it is an unusual training because unlike human medicine, you have to study multiple animal species, and including reptiles and birds. It's a very, very interesting training. I'm interested about what are again, I'm always interested in evolutionary things, but I think, for a long time in the West, we thought animals as sort of machines, and now we seem to acknowledge what's obvious, that they're sentient beings with a lot of emotions and feelings, and I don't know how much they are think about the future, but we're also starting to recognize ourselves as not the height of rationality, but that emotions are how humans communicate, and our feelings come prior to our rationality, if at all. And so I just think it's on the human-animal continuum, how important is it to see ourselves as animals today, and what does that help us in terms of dealing more effectively with each other and the world around us? So I mean, I'm just another animal on some level,
Well, that seems to have been the sort of the whole history of the ideas. Well, we have this idea that we started off with this massive gulf separating humans from animals, and it was really a sort of philosophical gulf, and that gulf is sort of slowly being narrowed, and now we allow some animals to kind of jump across the gap and join us as family members, but not all of them. But they represent sort of ambassadors, as it were. They represent that other group of animals out there, and I think that's an ongoing process. But at the same time, if you look at the discourse on animals historically, yes, at the level of educated people, there was all this talk about how animals were completely different from humans, and they didn't have souls, or and they were mechanisms or whatever. But at the popular or folk level, I don't think people ever believed that.
Right.
I think they lived with animals, and they knew that animals were sentient and had feelings and would respond in particular ways in the same way a person would. So I think there's always been this, not only, that sort of tension between the people who actually knew the animals and the intelligentsia who were kind of pontificating about animals.
Well, fairy tales are filled with snakes who know,
Exactly.
and fox who know.
And people who turn into animals, and animals that turn into people, and the gulf is obviously very permeable.
And children, as we've heard,
Right.
some of the major emotional development is, loving the stories about animals, even not just the animals around you. Little girls with horses, etc.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, it seems what is important about trying to understand as best we can what sort of consciousness or experience animals have to inform how we treat them. I think there's one of the larger arguments against, let's say, slaughtering animals is they're conscious or they have some sentient being. I'm not saying it's a complete argument, but that's something that is brought to bear when we talk about how we treat animals. And I find it interesting that when I've asked people to talk about whether you think animals have sentience or not, and that across a wide range of animal types, there are those I think who feel, well, absolutely, there's no doubt about it, how could you see it otherwise? And there are others who still persist in thinking in this sort of Cartesian way that animals are missing something that humans have that makes them less than. And earlier, Betsy, it was really interesting because I used the word personhood to describe my relationship with Dusty. I meant it in the sense because we didn't dress him up or treat him, we didn't wear human clothes.
Didn't put him in diapers.
We didn't kiss him on the lips, which I find disgusting, but anyway, with animals. But anyway, no, we didn't treat him like he was a person, literally. But I had a sense.
Now the truth comes out.
Yeah, it's right. No, but I actually think it's an interesting question whether when we try to decide whether animals have any degree of consciousness, is it possible that we are projecting our own consciousness onto them?
The age-old issue.
Right. So could that be playing some part? Because there are those who think, in terms of human consciousness, leaving animals aside, that we're actually projecting our own sense of consciousness. This is sort of Dennett's view of consciousness. It's an illusion that we are putting together a lot of sense data and other thoughts that go around our heads, and then we say we have a certain personhood. We're imposing that. And it's not a view I subscribe to, but it's out there. So the question, I think, is also with animals, how much of what we view as being the sentience of animals are a projection of ourselves? And that even extends to my experience of Dusty as a person, because in some ways, I look back and think of him as being like a human, and I thought, well, he didn't talk. Why do I have this persistent feeling that I had that sort of the verbally intimate relationship with him?
Well, this is the thing. We draw the line between humans and animals at language. And what that means is complicated.
That's right.
And I think that the issue of personhood is, to a large extent, a legal issue, because corporations have personhood and animals are objects in the eyes of the law. And I think, I don't think that all of us, especially those of us sitting around this table or in this room, need to be convinced that animals are intelligent, that they're sentient beings, that they're capable of loving us and vice versa. But the law needs to be convinced of that, because animals have very few protections. And New York State is one of the worst states in the country as far as animal cruelty laws go. And and I let my dogs kiss me in the face. But I probably shouldn't.
Actually, you're a much greater risk of infection with a human bite
Yes.
than you are of a dog bite. So
Yeah, there you go.
So
Kiss your dog goodnight.
yes, absolutely.
Trained all my family members not to bite me
But
anymore.
Right.
I'm sure you all know about the Non-Human Rights Project and Stephen Wise, who's trying to go through the courts to get the status of personhood for animals. And
Yeah,
in fact, last Friday, he just argued for an elephant, which is in the Bronx Zoo, an elephant ironically named Happy, who's been alone in a cage for, I don't know, how many years, 40 years or something, insane. And he's trying to go through the courts to argue that the elephant should have the status of personhood, that elephants cannot, that it's torture for them to be alone. What you're saying about adopt 2 dogs or 2 cats.
More so for elephants.
More so for elephants. And this elephant has 1 acre to move around in, which is very small for an elephant. And it had a companion. The companion died. Companion was never replaced. And the case was argued on Friday. There was a writ of habeas corpus in a lower court, and it went through, and the case is now going to be moved to the Bronx.
So I have a problem with invoking human rights language. So I'm no problem with the welfare of the elephant and that we have an obligation to
But how do you get around that in
promote
the
that.
courts without that?
Well, first off, we have to recognize that human rights are a human invention, and they don't exist in nature. And, I mean, and it's moral progress, and I'm in favor of that. But there's a history of human rights, and it's a useful fiction, just like money is a useful fiction, right? So, and I'm in favor of that discourse. But I think when we take it into our domesticated animals or wild animals or fish, I just think it leads to enormous confusion. Because now we're taking things that are different and we're treating them the same. And so some of this is why I always have indigestion philosophically. And I don't think animals have the same obligations to us that we have towards them. So if a bear wants to maul me and eat me or whatever, that's what bears do.
But do we have any obligation to that bear?
Yes, on another level, yes, we do. But not to the individual so much as the group. So I think species extinction is much greater problem than the suffering of any individual wild animal. And I think the way we treat wild animals versus domesticated animals, like, so
But if we can't,
bighorn sheep get pink eye, and it's well within our possibility to treat the pink eye in national parks or whatever. When they get pink eye, they fall off the cliff and die. And so there's a question, should we be intervening in the care of wild animals? And this is where, we got to maybe let natural selection do its thing. I don't know. But that's, how much are we responsible? We're habitat for sure. But on an individual level, I have a different problem with that, I think. So anyway, that's one of the big debates in animal ethics and environmental
I think
ethics.
the legal scholars are somewhat, the legal scholars, people who are making legal motions to help animals like Happy are trying to think, well, how do we get an entree to the legal world? And I guess this is like the most expedient way they've come up with, which is to try to define them that way. And it may or may not be a good idea. I kind of agree with what you said.
Well, I think
I understand the motivation too.
the courts also recognize that this is a slippery slope. If we give personhood to an ape or an elephant, what's next? And then you've got the whole animal industries saying, whoa, this has to stop.
I hate that slippery slope argument because it just stops progress.
No, I agree. It stops progress.
Yeah.
But it's a very real problem for the courts.
Yeah.
Because they can see the downstream effects of their rulings, and the implications are huge, huge for every level of society.
I want to just switch it a little bit in terms of our focus by asking Josh a question, because we're talking about the human-animal continuum. Mm-hmm. Are there soldiers or veterans who apply for a service dog who flunk?
Many.
And why? And what happens? Can you tell us a little bit of what, from the human side, makes it possible or impossible to relate?
Well, it's not a matter of relating. It's a matter of soldiers. If you raise a service dog and you have a facility for raising a service dog, you've been with that dog. Sometimes the first year is with prisoners, and then the prisoners they take the dog away from the prisoners, which is very traumatic for the prisoner, although they know it's coming. And then for the last year, they get this training. So the dog is probably worth $25,000 to $35,000. And they have immense love and respect for these animals that they've trained so carefully. And they want to make sure that the soldier will take care of the dogs and take responsibility. So soldiers coming back from war with PTSD go through a huge continuum, and it starts with rage and anger and fear, and often alcoholism and drug addiction. And there's a lot of things that come up with it that many of them deal with. And if you're addicted to drugs or if you're an alcoholic, you will not get a service dog. So they're basically turned down if they're not prepared to care for the animal. And they're grilled very carefully about that. But if they are prepared and they qualify, they can get the dog. Yeah.
And are there instances where still their nervous system is so compromised that they're not able to relax enough to relate to the animal?
Well, they don't own the animal for a year. When they give them this is I can't speak for all of them, but the 4 different facilities we worked with, they're all the same in this way. That the soldier gets the animal for 1 year, and they have to write reports bi-weekly or monthly about how it's going, and they have to come back and report and come with the dog, and they're evaluated.
That's interesting.
And at the end of the
Yeah, very.
year, they're either given the dog or they take the dog back.
So they're trying to instill a reflective process in
Yes,
that, yeah.
very much so. And the dogs and the soldiers take responsibility for that, because they don't want to. Once they get the dog and they bond with the dog and they fall in love with the dog, they don't want to lose that dog, because the dog is freedom, because they can actually go out, go somewhere, go to a store at some other place, not as something other than 3 a.m. to avoid people. To feel the connection that many commands that the dogs have give them real feeling of safety, that they won't have a flashback because the dog will know it's coming and be able to stop it and block it for them. Or if they're on the street and someone's coming too close, they can simply say, block, and the dog will immediately go in front and separate someone coming so that they don't have to feel someone's coming too close and they don't overreact and attack them and end up in jail, which happens a lot. So the relationship becomes profound.
So there's a huge change in the philosophy of training dogs, which is that you really never hit them or spank them. You only use positive reinforcement.
No choke.
No choke collars. No, and this is something that would benefit humans too, right? If we understood that if positive reinforcement is how you get good behavior, and negative reinforcement doesn't work. And I'm thinking of this in relationship with the Asian elephants that I got to know in Sri Lanka when I lived there for a year. Because there are about 300 temple elephants. There's about 3,000 wild elephants, and about 100 elephants who live in an orphanage as a herd with 2 matriarchs. And but the temple elephants are all tortured. That's how they train them. They separate them as children, and then they're tortured. The mahouts, every now and then one is killed. And then I'm thinking about all these the captured herd that lives in this orphanage, about 100 elephants. They breed in captivity, and the possibility of training elephants with positive reinforcement would seem to me like an obvious no-brainer. But when I grew up, you would hit your dog if they did something bad. You'd stick their nose in their if they defecated inside the house or something like that. That's how you trained a dog, and that's all not.
It's all gone.
All gone, and it works much better. So you're involved. I just want to point out that there's a whole new philosophy about training dogs than what I grew up with, and it applies to humans too.
Yeah, it somewhat parallels actually changes in, training of children, or how people advocated training children. The same sort of process seemed to go
They don't
on.
allow choke collars anymore?
Well,
Shock collars.
if you smack your child in Sweden now, you can be arrested. So.
Perhaps one of the most profound experiences I've had was at an elephant research center in Southern Kruger Park in South Africa. And all the houses were up on stilts with sort of moats around them. And one night there was this tremendous thundering sound. And a whole group of elephants came in and went toward the research center patio, where they had skulls of recently found elephants.
Oh.
And they recognized that it was a baby elephant and a female elephant that had been from their herd, and they had a funeral. The elephants had a funeral around these skulls, and since they were chipped, the researchers knew indeed these were from the herd. That has so impressed me. And the other was a giraffe that knew that the wind was going to change when its calf had broken its leg, and when the wind changed, the lions would come. But I don't think I've ever experienced, in a collective way, even with Italian wakes and Irish wakes, that level of just instinctive grief. Not reflective grief, instinctive grief.
Were there you witnessed this?
Yes,
Oh, it must
I
have been
heard
so
this.
moving. So
Yes,
moving,
yeah.
Elephants are extraordinary creatures. In the list of weird things that animals figure out that we don't is in the 2004 tsunami in South Asia, the elephants and the birds, they just all took off. They went inland. They knew long before the waves ever hit. And just again, there were humans that died, but there weren't any elephants that died. And so there's how does a dog recognize that their owner is going to have an epileptic fit?
Smells it.
And the owner doesn't know it, right? I mean, they smell it, right?
They smell it.
So there are things that they are sensate to that we are not.
For sure.
We might open this up for questions from the audience. And if so, would you come up and speak at the mic and identify yourself?
It's been wonderful. I'm a dog, and of late I've become a cat lover, and there hasn't been very much discussion about cats here. And I've rescued 3 feral cats, one from the woods in Pennsylvania, who was just crazy. And I wanted to bring her to New York City, and I talked to people here in New York. I said, you can't bring a feral cat. She'll destroy your house and everything. And one of them gave me a big cage, and I put her in the cage because it was going to be a cold winter up there, and I knew that. And I brought her back to my apartment, and I'm happy to report that she became the most charming Manhattan lady. She liked her martinis about 5 o'clock. I think that cats are very different than dogs. I mean, I've had lots of dogs and I have lots of cats. I've lately become a cat person. But I would like to hear what you have to say about that, because they're more mysterious. They're not, I don't think they're trainable at all. Dogs are, of course, trainable. They're domesticable, but I don't know if you can. I mean, my cat now never does anything that I tell her to do. I mean, I find them to be enormously intriguing and interesting, even maybe more than my dogs, which I love dearly. But last time my dog died, I just could not face, having another dog that would pass like that. It was just so heartbreaking. I'd just like to hear a little bit of discussion about.
Well, I love cats too.
Cats, I believe it.
I love cats too.
I do too.
But you're not going to find too many therapy PTSD cats.
No, and I think for good reason, because we've selected dogs for as animals that seek social approval. They want our approval. That's what gratifies them. Cats, they're not interested in social approval. They want approval, but it's not the same. It's not the same. They're not prepared.
They'll let us pet them and purr on us, and they're delighted when we feed them. And
but they don't show that same.
Sometimes they'll play with us a little bit, but not for long.
Yeah. The cat I have now will not get on my lap. Mm-hmm. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, she'll jump up on the bed and lay on my chest. Yeah. And she looks right at me and starts to lick me. That's the other thing I wanted to ask. When a cat licks you, is she trying to eat you, or is she trying to...
Good question.
Is she giving you... I think it's affection.
I think she's going for the salt.
What's that?
I think she's going for the salt.
That raises a question I'd like to ask you. I had read that cats can be feral. Mm-hmm. And then if they're domesticized, they can become domestic, and that it's actually different brain parts of the brain and different systems, that they can negotiate both the wild and a domestic situation. Is that so?
I don't know if that's altogether true, because you can have the same situation with dogs. So you mentioned earlier that most of the world's dog population is what they call nowadays free roaming. They're not really feral because people own them, but the expectations in many developing countries is that your dog lives outside and it's free to wander about, but it comes home from time to time for food and what have you. And so dogs can navigate this as well. And cats, I think, are very similar. I mean, their history is very different as well. I mean, people, I think in the early years, wanted cats primarily to be around the house and the farm to keep down the rodent population. They weren't seeking social contact so much with cats, and I think the cats have moved in on us rather than us exploiting them for our, attachments.
But Feral, I just wanted to say that there's a kind of confusion about feral cats. People think that feral cats are a different species than domestic cats.
Yeah, not at all.
They're exactly the same cats.
That's what I thought.
And, feral cats were often, cats that were kicked out of their homes for one reason or another, and they got used to being stray. Just as stray dogs can be very hard to catch because they're used to keeping people away.
Well, and if they're not fixed and they reproduce, they breed like vermin. I mean, when I lived in Jerusalem a long time ago, the feral
Talking about cats.
Cats, they were in and out of the garbage everywhere you went. It was like, you walk past a garbage container and 10 cats would jump out. It was
Yeah.
really, and in Sri Lanka where I lived, there were three types of dogs. There were house dogs, neighborhood dogs, and then there were feral dogs. And but what was curious to me that there wasn't a culture of talking to dogs, and that was very, very strange.
Maybe people still spoke to each other.
No, I think there just wasn't a lot of history of house dogs or whatever. But
Yeah.
or there's a kind of an autism that some cultures might have about speaking to animals or whatever. But with the elephants, they're about 30 people are killed every year by elephants, and about 30 elephants are killed by people every year. And it's all farmer, conflict. The elephants some bachelor comes in, tears up the lawn. They try to shoot the elephant. The elephant comes back. They don't kill the elephant. Comes back and they know exactly who shot them, which house it was, and they go after that house. And so I'm thinking, well,
Tigers do that
if the
too.
people knew that these are personalities, that they had names, and they could follow them on the internet or whatever, and everybody agreed to use names and talk to them, and to sort of negotiate between two intelligent species how we can get along
Yes.
on an individual
Good
level,
idea.
right?
Yeah.
And so somebody needs to equip the villagers and standardize the language and signaling or whatever. Realize that each one of these elephants has a personality, a history.
There are groups trying to do that.
That would go a long way to getting rid of human-elephant conflict.
Yeah.
I think the other interesting thing about the question about cats and dogs goes back to the question I was trying to pose before about pigs and dogs, and that is different animals are good at different things and are clever or not clever, the case may be, in different ways, depending on their genetics, where they come from. There's an interesting new development in the study of plasticity and neuroplasticity in brains, and not just human brains, in which the notion is that we inherit certain genetic codes that actually provide some degree of a plastic response. In other words, it's the difference between some sort of hardwired instinct and then some general drive that can sort of be expressed in many different ways. So an animal going from what we're calling a feral state to a domestic state sort of is what's allowed by their nervous system, the plasticity that's part of their nervous system. So if they're in this environment, they can adapt in this way, and then if they're in that environment, they adapt in a different way. But it's interesting to think in terms of cats and dogs is that the dogs' wish to ingratiate themselves had to start with the fact that the foxes or whatever animals, wolves from which the dogs were domesticated, showed some inclination that way. After all these generations of cats that have been domesticated, they still, there are cats that are more friendly, will get on your lap, and people always brag about that. My cat is like a dog, but that doesn't seem to be within the range of their plasticity yet. They could be bred to do this probably in the future, but dogs were easy to do that way. I think it was in the range of their possibilities, and with cats less so. So I think that's
One comment on the legality of animal rights is we live, it's sort of an abnormal time where animals don't have any legal representation, but in the Middle Ages, they would actually try animals if they trampled crops or destroyed or even killed a person. They'd have a trial, and sometimes the animals got off of mitigating circumstances, or they were too young to know it was wrong to eat the baby, or whatever. So post-Enlightenment, the Newtonian mechanical worldview that we've inherited, by the way, is an anomaly in human history, where in the past people lived more closely. They had a more intimate relationship with animals, and it was reflected in recognition of the animals having some sort of legal representation when they transgressed and damaged human property. The other thing, you mentioned plasticity of the brain. You mean epigenetics?
Well, perhaps, yes. I
Okay.
mean, not necessarily, though, because the idea here that in some of these instances, the genes are conferring a trait that has some degree of plasticity built into it. You see, so that if this, then that, if that, then that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Because right now in evolutionary theory, they've discovered in the last maybe 8 years, neo-Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics. So like this gentleman who was talking about cats, if he had children and he has an intimate, perhaps, love of cats, they might be predetermined to inherit that orientation towards cats because his brain was triggered in such a way emotionally to like that particular animal, So I think it's interesting that people now are having very intimate relationships with cats, where in the past they were a barnyard predator and just kept around until maybe 1930s as a barnyard animal to kill, mice and rats. And now people are taking them into their houses and trying to domesticate this inherently very predatory animal and treat it like a dog and hope it responds. The other thing is I'm wondering, I haven't heard anybody talking here about the effect of zoonotic infectious bacteria or viruses transmitted to humans from domesticated animals, and the effect on our brains, where our brains may be conditioned by those bacteria to respond a certain way to the animal. And I'm thinking of Toxmos plasmosis gondii, that kind of came out with that article and book by Kathleen McLaverty.
Yeah, so about 10% of humans are probably infected with.
No, it's more than that.
Toxins.
Worldwide, it's around 60%. In America,
so we'll
it's
have to-
around 30%.
And with negative consequences. It's not good for your health. It's an interesting virus that mostly in cats and rats and mice. But
Well, compared to the revelations this morning in the New York Times about Johnson's & Johnson's
right,
baby powder,
baby powder, right.
which has asbestos in it, I'm not so worried about toxoplasm, although maybe I should be.
But let me just say that in the history of domesticated animals, that's where most of our communicable diseases come from.
Cats?
So,
No, animals.
Oh.
Cattle and
I see.
sheep, and I mean, most of our big diseases, we evolved.
But not cancer.
No, I understand, but the communicable diseases.
Actually, cancer is caused by viruses, a lot of it.
In some cases, that's right.
Breast
but-
cancer especially.
Thank you for raising a whole bunch of issues. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
The animal trials one is something I looked into a while back. There's a very interesting guy called Bernard Chassinet. He was a medieval French jurist who made his reputation, actually, by going around France and defending animals in animal trials. He got a tremendous reputation for doing this, and he was one of the people who was very good at getting animals acquitted. He got a swarm of locusts acquitted somewhere in the south of France because his argument was that they weren't able to control their craving for the crops. So they had gone in there and eaten the crops, and that if in the future people wanted locusts not to eat their crops, and they had to provide the locusts with something else to eat. And the judge bought it, apparently. He said, yes, okay,
Sensible.
we'll let them off this time.
Were they
wonder what the
incarcerated so that they were in
alternative
jeopardy?
No, they didn't come to the court, the locusts.
Yeah,
They didn't show up for their own trial.
Tried in absentia.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was an interesting time because it wasn't clear that people actually thought the animals knew knew about their own culpability. It was more a view that if a crime was committed, then somebody had to pay the price for it just to kind of maintain the social order. And so they went through these elaborate trials, which really, they were sham trials, but some of these jurists got very, very, very famous and successful as a result.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
I'm Henry Earl. I live over here on York Avenue between the Animal Medical Center and New York Hospital. And I've been struck over the last
Which one do you tend to go to?
That's what I was going to ask you.
That's your insurance, I'm sure.
Over the last many years, I've been struck with the sophistication of the techniques, diagnostic and therapeutic, at the Animal Medical Center. And I've wondered about informed consent at both places, but particularly at the Animal Medical Center. So, of course, there is no informed consent, but procedures are extremely costly and often unproven, and the outcomes are often very unpredictable. The other area that I'm interested in, related to it, is end-of-life care for these domestic animals and how the decisions are made.
Yeah. So there is informed consent, but of course it's for the owner. So owners are given a consent form. So if any procedure is planned that's going to be costly or potentially dangerous to the animal, the owner has to sign off on it as the proxy, in the same way that a parent might sign off for a very young child.
The difference is the cost is all on you.
It is, and
as the
also,
client, and it's all optional.
and if the doctors screw up and your animal dies, the best you can hope for is the the replacement value of the animal, which is not of great benefit to someone for whom this animal is the thing they love most in the world. But that's another story. But yes, we have now this situation where the veterinary profession has, actually under pressure from clients, has all the modern medical techniques and treatments that are available to people at a similar cost, although it tends to be cheaper for animals, even though they're doing the same treatment. We get this situation now where a lot of animals are on their last legs. Keeping them alive is probably cruel, and the owners won't let go. The owner says, do everything you can. Spare no expense. Just do whatever you can. And the vet says, well, there's nothing more we can do. Well, just try it. And we have the situation quite frequently now in our veterinary hospital at the University of Pennsylvania, where everyone, the staff, the nurses, everyone is putting pressure on the veterinarian to euthanize the animal. And the veterinarian says, I can't, because the owner won't let me. And it's the owner's property. And because it's the owner's property legally, I have to do what they say, or I can refer them to another veterinarian. But if I refer them to another veterinarian, that's going to be even more cruel, because we can at least keep the animal comfortable. So it's a very difficult situation now.
But I think one of the differences is that a lot of the veterinary services, medical services, are actually superior to what we get as humans.
I can't speak to that.
Well, thank you so much. It was a lively, very compelling, very enlightening conversation. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your experience and your knowledge with us.
Thank you for
and thank you all for coming.
facilitating so well. You kind of kept it all moving very well.
So when's...
Oops, good.
The magic trick, just every day get help from hiking. Oh, great.
Yeah.
come with you when it comes to that.
My friend has a